Okay, continuing chapter 13. It says, a giant killer macrophage, doctor, this is madness. And that is a representation of a white blood cell, the type of white blood cell that defends you by responding to a signal and then eating whatever the signal is, the antibody is attached to, the antibody being the signal molecule. There's fluids at all sorts of different levels. Our cells are bags full of fluid. That's the only way that our chemistry works, is that all of our stuff is dissolved in the water, and that gives it freedom to move around. In order for our cells to be active, we talked about this when we talked about single-celled organisms. In order for your cells to be active, they need fluid around them, or at least on one side of them, that it would be the active side, which happens sometimes on surfaces. Epithelium is active on one side, and well, maybe depending on what's on the other side, very often in your body there is fluid on both sides. But extracellular fluid are things like the lymph, what leaks out of the capillaries. Your cells are awash in all sorts of extracellular fluid. So that's a very, very common thing. Your blood plasma is an extracellular fluid. Hemolymph, which is a kind of a lymph and blood combination and very common in open systems, is an extracellular fluid. Diffusion. Very often when you study diffusion, you look at things dissolved in water moving from high concentration areas to low concentration areas. The water does that too. Water diffuses from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. We'll cover this in a lot more detail in the second semester, but the movement of water by diffusion is called osmosis. I think just to focus on, it's so easy to ignore that the water particles do the same thing as the particles dissolved in the water. They gave it kind of a name. And you want the cells that are active to be in osmotic balance with their surroundings, so they're not losing or gaining too much water. Because keep in mind, if your intracellular fluids are there to allow your chemistry to work, well, if you make the contents more dilute or less dilute, then the chemicals are going to be bopping into one another. The molecules are going to be hitting one another at rates that they're not supposed to be. Is that you want your internal fluids and your external fluids in balance. Our ancestors that evolved in the oceans developed a chemistry that was in osmotic balance with their surroundings. So the water levels in the ocean water and the water levels in the cells were the same. So no net influx, no net outflow of water. A great system and perfectly logical when you're evolving and you don't really have this complexity to mess with that. Now, we're not in balance with ocean water. Our ancestors, the bony fish, invaded the fresh water of the land, and they couldn't be in osmotic balance with fresh water. It's fresh water, it's 100% water, but they did, over the course of a long period of evolution, get a little bit more dilute than ocean water. They're waterproof, not that big a deal. Even the bony fish that went back into the oceans are still slightly more dilute than their surroundings. But because they are largely waterproof, that only becomes an issue across the gills and across the digestive system. So it's not really that big a deal. They've not readjusted over many, many, many millions of years of evolution. But osmotic balance is a very critical aspect of systems. Dissolved in the fluid is a whole bunch of stuff. Sodium, chloride. It turns out that carbon dioxide dissolves in water, but it doesn't dissolve in water as carbon dioxide. It dissolves in water as bicarbonate ions. Ions dissolve much better than non-ions. Talk a little bit about blood. Lots of things dissolved in blood, right? Because your blood's your distribution system. Now, there are things that are there for regulation effect. There are hormones that we'll talk about when we talk about that type of control system. There's enzymes. There are clotting factors, so that if something happens and your blood is leaking, you can patch the leak. There's molecules. In us, we use albumin. I don't know if that's universal, but in order to adjust the osmotic balance between our blood and our tissues, like say you just drank a big bottle of water, and a whole bunch of water floods into your circulation system from your digestive system. Well, your kidneys, as soon as the blood starts to get more dilute, it dumps albumin into it to change that ratio. It adds particles to the water to bring the concentration of water down. So as the particle levels go up, the water levels go down because they're sharing the same space. And there's a number depending on the animals, there may be a number of proteins that are immunological. Some animals produce, honest to goodness, antibiotics. We produce antibodies and a whole class of what are called immunoglobulins that help to detect and fight certain types of invaders. There's nutrients dissolved in the blood, right? It's a distribution system. These are usually breakdown products of digestion. So it's amino acids that we'll use to build into proteins. It's small carbohydrates that we'll use for energy or store as larger carbohydrates or use as cell markers. There are components of fats and oils, lipids, which don't really dissolve in water very well, so they need to be carried on proteins that will stick to them and help them sort of kind of dissolve in the fluids. They settle out in places, build up on the inside of arteries. That can be bad. As we mentioned before, oxygen doesn't dissolve in blood very well. It needs to be either attached to carriers or attached to carriers in dedicated little blood cells, like we have oxygen carrying cells. And also dissolved in the blood are waste materials. Carbon dioxide in the bicarbonate form, ammonia or ammonia adjusted molecules. When we talk about waste materials, we'll come back to that. And for animals that live in the air, there's nitrogen dissolved in the blood because the air around us is about 3/4 nitrogen. It doesn't do anything. It is soluble in water, so it goes in and out of your blood. Basically, it just, because it can. It isn't diffusing because there isn't any higher concentration, lower concentration. It just is going. It's only a problem if you're a scuba diver and you relieve the pressure on it really fast and it bubbles up. Let me move this. Okay, so we're going to talk about now, we are not the only ones that have blood cells, but it's unusual to have oxygen-carrying blood cells, so you just find those in vertebrates. Well, yeah, I don't think invertebrate chordates have those. I'd have to look that up. A lot of other animals have immune system cells, fighter cells. And in some animals, they have secretory cells circulating in their blood. We don't really have that. We secrete stuff into the blood, but we don't release secretion producing cells into our blood. But if you've got a big open system, you can do that. Red blood cells are red because they have rust in them. They have hemoglobin, oxidized iron. Iron is an oxygen carrier. Well, it oxidizes it, produces it, it sticks to it somewhat, and then comes loose to it later. One of the problems with carbon monoxide poisoning is carbon monoxide sticks to hemoglobin much more tightly, and so can accumulate in your blood and block all the places the hemoglobin is supposed to be carrying oxygen. And so it gradually deprives your body of oxygen because it's not, carbon monoxide's in the way, and it's not distributing oxygen appropriately. Um, red blood cells, also called erythrocytes, which, here's the surprise, is Latin for red cells. White blood cells called leukocytes, which leuka is kind of an off-white, but it's a white. Okay, I'm going to move this. I want some room here. Macrophage, a big eater. Phagocytosis, cell eating. Now typically called a type of endocytosis, but it goes back a ways to the original. And this is one of the things that your white blood cells do. They literally eat invaders. They may eat bacteria that have invaded, or small protozoans, or cell components from damaged cells. So it is a primary function of white blood cells, but it's not the only thing that they do. White blood cells also can poison invaders. There's killer cells. One of the common poisons that are used are oxygen radicals, which are extremely reactive, are produced by a lot of our chemistry. When we discovered that we take in a bunch of chemicals that are oxygen or oxidation fighting oxidants, antioxidants, like vitamin C and vitamin A and a bunch of vitamin D, a bunch of other ones. It was decided, oh, well, if our body needs these, let's throw a whole bunch at it. What harm could it do? Well, it turns out that using oxygen radicals is something your body does. It uses it to fight invaders. So people would go, oh, you've got cancer, you should pump up all the vitamins you're taking. Well, cancer is like that because the antioxidants prevent some of your white blood cells from killing the cancer cells. We also use oxygen radical production as a signal to build more muscle. So if you're taking antioxidants and pumping iron, you're not going to build muscle as quickly as if you're not taking a lot of extra antioxidants. We do need the antioxidants, but we don't necessarily need extra antioxidants. And there's other types of poisoning that white blood cells do as well. When something is in you that's too big for a white blood cell to really do anything too effectively, but it's stationary, they will surround it with effectively a little nodule of bony material. They'll calcify around it. Trichinella is a parasite of meat eaters that passes from one meat eater to another. The larval worms coil up in muscle and just sit there. And your white blood cells will surround it and form little calcium nodules. Try to isolate them from the system. That's what calcification is for. For a lot of invaders, they move, so you can't calcify around them effectively. But there's some inserts or artificial things that people have surgically implanted that over time will flake and or lose other types of bits and pieces, and sometimes you get calcification of those as kind of a long-term side effect. You have white blood cells that are detectors. They literally pull molecules off of things or react to molecules with molecules on their surfaces. The molecules they're reacting to, the molecules that don't belong in you, are called antigens. They generate an anti-response. And a really fancy thing that some of your white blood cells do is they can take those molecules and make a capper molecule, an attachment for it, that one end will attach to the antigens. The other end is basically an immune system flag. It tells these guys, come in and kill whatever I've attached to. And those are antibodies. And antibodies are fairly specific. Sometimes you make an antibody for one thing and it'll attach to other things it's not supposed to, like your own cells. Autoimmune diseases, you've made antibodies to, one assumes an actual antigen at some point, but it also isn't specific enough and attaches, say, to your insulin-making cells. That's type 1 diabetes. Your immune system goes, oh, okay, the flags have gone up, let's kill these, and it kills your insulin-making cells. There's a number of autoimmune diseases that do that. And you have a whole class of white blood cells that are in the antibody-making business. Your B cells are in the antibody-making business. You have white blood cells, a type of white blood cells, that's a T. Mostly embedded in your surfaces that respond to invasion. The typical thing that sets them off is the release of chemicals from inside a cell to the tissue fluid, which only happens when the cells are damaged. So they react to, oh, we have damage, something bad is going on, let's get the army in here to fight whatever the heck is happening. And those cells, which are called different cells depending on where they are, but they're typically called mast cells, release histamines. Histamines send a signal out to white blood cells in the neighborhood coming through the capillaries, come here. And it causes the capillaries to expand. Makes them leakier, makes it easier for the white blood cells to get out. But it also leaks fluid. It expands the capillaries so more red blood cells go through them, more deep tissue blood goes through them. The red blood cells can't leak out through the gaps, but it does redden the area. The area swells up with the excess fluid. It gets warm because there's more blood going through it. So that's inflammation. The swelling and redness and warmth are side effects. What's really going on is an increased invasion of white blood cells to fight whatever is going on. As a coach, somebody twists their ankle, they go, do you think I really did damage? I go, well, wait. If you've really damaged it, you're going to get swelling before very long because you've damaged cells, you're going to get that reaction. If you've just kind of insulted it a little bit, it'll hurt, but the pain will go away and it won't swell up. And that's a pretty good marker for you probably not having sprained your ankle. The system apparently needs training with legitimate invaders. This is part of what's called the hygiene hypothesis, where early in a typical animal's life, there are legitimate things trying to get into them that are potentially pathogenic, can hurt them. And if you don't have those, at some point your immune system starts to go, well, we need to react to something. So they will react to common environmental antigens, we call them allergens under these conditions, that you really should be just used to and not reacting to because they're not legitimate invaders. This is what produces allergies. It's a legitimate immune response to things you shouldn't really be responding to. And that's why we don't call them antigens, we call them allergens. But again, it causes inflammation. If the allergens get deep into your tissues, which happens with food allergies or with injectables like venom, then the inflammation can spread from the contact site, and it can spread. If it spreads too far, right, your capillaries expand all over the place. Your fluid leaks out. Your blood pressure plummets. That's anaphylactic shock. That can kill you. That's an extreme allergic reaction. Thrombocytes, which in a lot of animals are full cells. In us, we just have little flakes of thrombocytes. They break up in your bone marrow, and those are called platelets. This is hemostasis, which is a real fancy word for coagulation or clotting, where, now here's the surprise. Clotting is initiated by turbulence. Blood cells get cut, blood leaks out, it tumbles. And the turbulence sets off a cascade of activated proteins, and the activated proteins go from being little round things in your circulation called fibrin to long sticky threads called fibrinogen is the little ones. Fibrin is the long sticky one. And it forms a patch that on a molecular level kind of looks like a gauze patch. But in order to increase the sealing nature, these cells get into the patch and really seal it up. And if you think about it, because I remember growing up, I used to think that your blood clotted because it hit the air. But, a lot of animals don't live in the air, they live in the water. It'd be kind of nice if their blood didn't leak out when their blood vessels broke too. So it isn't a reaction to the air, it's a reaction to tumbling. Also, you'd want to clot inside if you have bleeding inside. Unfortunately, sometimes tumbling in your tissues, especially in arteries where there are deposits, what happens is those lipid particles stick to the side, they form bumps, the blood tumbles, you clot over it to smooth it down, now you're sticking stuff on the clot, you clot over that, and eventually you can close the artery almost completely up with these deposits that build up over time. Okay, that's another good place to stop.